This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Let's go to the spring of 2015, 10 years ago, when racial harmony in this country was at an all-time high. Both personal and structural inequalities were solved, all because of one plucky Seattle coffee chain. All right, look, folks, I'm going to try and avoid too much snark in this episode, which is going to be a little tough because, yes, we are revisiting the days of Starbucks and their Race Together campaign. Do you remember this? Starbucks encouraging their baristas to write the phrase "race together" on coffee cups in the hopes of sparking conversations across the racial divide in their stores. Safe to say, this effort did not go exactly as planned. It was announced to great fanfare, but was quickly roasted harder than a bag of Starbucks coffee beans. So here to discuss. You didn't like that one? I thought you would like that one.
It was actually really good, but I think you can't be encouraged.
Fair enough. Here to discuss the very short-lived Race Together effort are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Had you kind of memory hold this in the same way that I had?
This is weirdly at the top of my brain. I think about this all the time because it's such it's iconic, especially when Starbucks recently decided they were going to go back to writing on the cups. And I was like, oh, that has not worked for you historically.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It was, first of all, I can't believe this is like the 10th anniversary. Mm-hmm. I don't know what kind of time warp I'm in, but I'm like, that was 10 years ago? I don't know if it feels like it was longer or sooner, but it feels weird that we're talking about it in this moment. And I also remember it being laughable because it was like, anyone who goes into a Starbucks, if you were like me, and I assume I'm like many people, it is about expediency, right? It is like the fast food of coffee. It is like you want to go in, you want to get your coffee, you want to get out, you either want to hop on a train or get back in your car or, go wherever you're going. It is not the time, for me at least, to be like, hey, so systemic racism. Thoughts, know?
and that was a lot of the pushback, and we should get to that. But let's give Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz, let's try and get in the mind at least of the billionaire for a moment and understand where we were at that moment and why Starbucks decided to take this on. So I think that 10 years ago, if listeners can remember, I think two big sort of cultural, political context to keep in mind is it is the end of the Obama era, right? Mm-hmm. And it is also in the wake of the Ferguson protests. Mm-hmm. So, that's the context in which this is happening. I think there is a kind of both urgency to conversations about race and policing in specific, while also, I think, coming off an era where it felt like, okay, this country is finally starting to have some of these big conversations. We elected a black president. We reelected a black president. Maybe there is a level of understanding and progress that can be made. Am I embodying Howard Schultz's mindset correctly?
This is like, I would say, in the early stages of the Black Lives Matter movement, which correct me if I'm wrong, I think starts in 2014, but 2015, it's still very much gaining its momentum and sort of like how people are thinking of it, not just as a slogan or a campaign, but actually as as a movement. And so, these conversations are swirling, and you kind of can't turn away from the news where it feels like every single week there's some sort of unarmed black person that's being killed by the police. And more people are paying attention to this and the fact that it's happening on Obama's watch, right? But I think the fact that it's happening while Obama is still in office is causing people to sort of have this, cognitive dissonance about what's taking place.
Actually, just even as you're saying that, I'm also realizing another element here that is very Obama era. And Niki, I'm sure you have thoughts on this, but it's like the Obama era and the Obama administration was very corporate friendly. And the idea that a CEO, a forward-thinking CEO, a kind of this, Starbucks isn't a tech company, but a sort of like progressive-y, techy, Seattle-based company could convene these conversations and solve some of these problems. This was the era. This was probably the height of that, where it was like Uber's going to solve transportation, and dating is being solved by OkCupid and so forth. And so like. That's in the brew, so to speak, as well. Sorry.
Even more than that techno-optimism, Starbucks is part of a larger trend that was happening in corporations starting in the 1990s and the 2000s, which was this idea of conscientious capitalism, that you could both do good and make a ton of money. And I think this was very much closer to the heart of the ethos of a company like Ben & Jerry's, but Starbucks comes out of that same moment. A lot of these tech companies are born with that same idea, right? Like Google's do no evil ethos. It wasn't just that these tech companies were going to solve things, but that they were going to make the world a better place, and that was completely in line with capitalism. And so when Howard Schultz is looking at, Ferguson on fire, when he's looking at all of these headlines of unarmed black men who are being shot by the police, he's like, oh, well, my company can make the world a little better. How can we do this over coffee? So I do think that kind of glow around corporate capitalism. Interestingly, I think this is also kind of the turning point where that is starting to fade, because you have real pushback against tech companies that is churning in the mid-2010s. You have this much more critique of pinkwashing and greenwashing, and the sense that these corporate entities aren't actually looking out for our best good, our best interests, but they're selling us something instead of trying to fix things.
This is a bit of an aside, but I'm actually rewatching that show Silicon Valley. It's the 10th anniversary of that show that came out in 2015. And it is stunning how much that show... I'm like, why is no one talking about this? That show called out where that techno-optimism was going to end up. In the very first episode of that show, someone calls a tech CEO a fascist, and it's like, oh my God, this show saw where it was going. So yes, I think, Niki, you're right that is starting to creep in, and obviously plays into the backlash here of hey, these companies aren't going to make the world a better place, certainly in the way that they try and implement this. So let's talk about the Race Together initiative itself. It's worth pointing out one thing that is a product of this is it is a result of a lot of internal conversations that Starbucks has had with their employees, and they've had a bunch of forums where they've talked about this. And, we can get into all the very valid Starbucks critiques. My sense is that as an internal company, they do a pretty good job with DEI and these kinds of conversations. And I think they were having a lot of those conversations. And then Schultz was like, well, look, if we're doing this with our employees, maybe we can do this with the whole country. So they
correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Did Starbucks not roll back its DEI programs in the wake of this?
No, well, they roll back. They roll back.
I feel like I need to receive receipts. You know what I mean?
Well, look, the receipts are how do they pay their workers and do they allow them to unionize? But that's another question. They retreat from this. We'll get to it. They do continue. I mean, there's some stuff in 2018 and 2019 that they do that seems to have been a little bit of, we learned some lessons from this Race Together fiasco, and we're going to try and do some more internal work. I don't know. It's a big, very complicated company. You can find moments where they act laudably, and you can find lots of moments where they just act like a big corporation.
The problem I feel like I have with these ideas is actually not so much the idea itself. I mean, sure, I'll give you 2 points for intention, right? But at the same time, I feel like before you can ever turn the gaze on somebody else, you have to turn it back on yourself. And you can't ask people to have these conversations if your entire boardroom is white men. Do you know what I mean? You can't ask people to have these conversations if all your managerial positions, all your higher ups are of one single demographic. It just screams of hypocrisy. And I think that's another part of it that people are sort of like, oh, wait a second. Yeah. You want me to have this conversation. Are you having this conversation in meaningful ways at the upper echelons? Right. And I just don't think that's happening.
What I also find interesting, Kellie, is that very idea of the conversation. I mean, if we can get back into Howard Schultz's brain meat for a moment. That idea that conversation is what resolves social conflict. This was actually kind of at the heart of the Obama campaign as well, but it's particularly powerful among social and political elites. This idea that what we need is more understanding. It is
Bill Clinton. We did an episode on that with Bill Clinton. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think we actually mentioned race together in that
episode. On race. Yeah.
That's why it was queued up in my head. Well, yeah, I think that's the idea, right? And we talked about the same dynamic then. But that idea that it's just a kind of lack of understanding that is the source of so many problems, which suggests that, like, underneath it all, we all share the same commitments and ideas and goals, and we just have these miscommunications in place that are stopping us from getting there.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of us hold that notion anymore, but it was extremely powerful in the Obama era.
It is time to welcome a new show to the Radiotopia family, and it is kind of perfect for this moment we're in right now. It is called Never Post. It's a show for and about the internet, hosted by Mike Rugnetta. This show will help you understand why the internet, and as an extension, the whole world, is the way it is. Never Post talks to lawyers, artists, linguists, content creators, sociologists, historians, philosophers, developers, more, to try and get a real understanding of the place the internet holds in our world and our lives lived online. Each episode starts with the news so you can know in simple terms what the heck is going on, and then it launches into a fully immersive and sound-designed exploration of a critical aspect of our online lives. So, that's the new show from Radiotopia, Never Post, a podcast for and about the internet. Episodes every other week at neverpo.st and wherever you find your podcasts. This episode is brought to you by Quince. So let me tell you how I spent a recent Sunday morning. We have this big wall calendar in my house, the whole year at a glance, and a couple times a year we take it off the wall and fill it out with our plans. This most recent time it was all about spring and summer travel, laying out the windows where we are going to try and take some fun trips. And guess what we will need on those trips? Some great luggage. It is time to travel in style, folks, and this year I am treating myself to the luxury upgrades I deserve with Quince's high-quality travel essentials at fair prices. Quince has premium luggage options and stylish tote bags to carry it all. And while you're on your trip, you are of course going to want to look good. Quince has lightweight European linen styles from $30, washable silk tops, comfy lounge sets. I just picked up a couple great pairs of new sunglasses, one for the car, one for my suitcase. People used to travel in style, folks, and I am doing what I can to bring it back. And of course, all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. So for your next trip, treat yourself. Go to quince.com/thisday for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. Happy travels. Starbucks launches this in partnership with USA Today. Talk about another thing that's like 10 years ago. USA Today, all right. But they launch it with a huge spread in USA Today and a bunch of ads and an essay from Schultz in which he says, "For all our country's progress, barriers to social justice and economic equality exist in far too many corners. Race together is not a solution, but it is an opportunity to begin to re-examine how we can create a more empathetic and inclusive society, one conversation at a time." And so, you know, I'd rather take a CEO who writes that than says,
sure,
I don't care about DEI at all. But
absolutely,
at the same time, of course, you immediately say, okay, but I think Starbucks can do probably more than this, right? And they did not, as we talked about this with the Clinton Forum stuff, they did not pair it with, and here is a bunch of money, or here is a concrete diversity effort, or you know, here is legislation that we're trying to support. And so I think that is as cringy as the kind of like yeah, let's have a conversation in the coffee shop where you just want to get your latte. I also think the fact that it wasn't backed up with some concrete stuff was a huge part of this. But can we get to the memes and the roasting? So yeah. So yes, the idea here was they're going to write race together on a cup, hand it to you, and then you will be inspired to what? Turn to the nearest black person?
I mean, what does this mean?
Yeah.
Oh man, no. I feel like I'm sure that there are moments when, and we've all had this, when you've been in a Starbucks, hey, how you doing? How's your day going? You know, like chit chat, small talk, whatever it is. But these are conversations that are, for the most part, rather intimate. You know what I mean? And sort of like get at the interiority of people's lives that people are not willing or ready to engage in a very public format. When someone is standing behind you like, bro, I'm just trying to get my caramel macchiato. You know, that is not and so it got torn apart because of because it was easy to tear apart, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not as though they trained any of the baristas to have these conversations either. It's not like they're like, we have all spent 40 hours in DEI training to facilitate these conversations. No.
Sure, you're putting the baristas at the front line of this thing, you know.
Yes,
which is
yes.
I mean, the baristas are being sort of roped into it, but also the customers are. And I didn't consent to have a conversation about racism in the United States at 7 a.m. before I've had caffeine. Like that's not a good setup for it, and it's not safe for a lot of people to have those conversations or have those conversations thrust upon them. I do think I'm going to do you got to hand it to them for one moment, which is to say, like, I do think it harkens back to this idea of what coffee shops were, right?
Yes.
The coffee shop was the public square. Now I'm talking like in 19th century Vienna, it was the public square, and it was the place where like people would come and you actually would build community. And that idea of Starbucks as a third space where people would gather and you actually would be among your neighbors and you would be among people you were in community with, and you could have casual conversations. Maybe you could have more intimate conversations. That idea that you would actually like have in real life conversations, especially in a moment when social media is starting to absorb all of politics.
Yes.
There is something like beautifully utopian and also horrifically naive about that. But I do think that it is worth, there's a kernel of a good idea in there, which is that we need to have space to have these kind of like intimate in-person conversations. I don't think the Starbucks line is it, and I don't think the baristas need to be catching strays over it, but it does seem like there's a kernel of a good idea there.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I was thinking about the exact same thing. I think people know that I'm, kind of obsessed with the sort of lack of third spaces in these kinds of places where people are, I think 2015, 10 years ago, is also the moment we're starting to see the real loneliness epidemic kick in a huge way. Just to add on to what you're saying, I mean, I think Starbucks itself thinks of itself as like playing that role and being that third space. And even more recently, as they're trying to reboot, they've started to use that language. But the way that third spaces work, and this is the whole kind of like bowling alone Robert Putnam thing, it's like you start those conversations not about politics. You get to know people through the texture of everyday stuff. And then the conversation, the difficult conversation about race is the 19th conversation you have with that person after you've been in a bowling league or you've hung out at the coffee shp or you're in church together or you're on the PTA together.
How are your kids?
But and so for Starbucks to just kind of like try and shortcut that, talk, if they were just saying like, hey, get to know your neighbor. Get to know someone. Let's just talk. Let's linger, let's get to know each other. And then, you see that person over and over. You talk, don't I know you, and then maybe you end up just talking about it. But I think that's what a lot of people don't get about these attempts to get people to talk about difficult things together is you have to build slowly up to it.
Yes. Because I don't think there's a single example, could be wrong, of a person that's like, yo, I wrote Race Together, and next thing I know, we're like, deep diving on these things.
I've thought about this. I wonder if there's win out there? I'd be very curious.
Somebody who's like, this worked.
Right. Yeah.
One community out there that defunded the police because of a particularly good Starbucks.
Look, Kylie Jenner handed that Pepsi to a cop, and that solved everything. Right?
Jody, I was just looking that up because I was like, was that around the same time? It was in August of 2017, which is particularly inauspicious timing because it's like a week before Charlottesville.
Yeah.
But that very idea that like our consumption habits are going to defeat police brutality and racism in society strikes me as slightly naive.
Somehow the Pepsi thing was even worse because it was like trying to make the product itself the thing.
Yeah,
it was
absolutely
like,
worse.
If Starbucks had been like, we have a black and white foam latte that shows how we could, that would have been like, oh God. Okay. So what we're really marking here, of course, is the fact that pretty quickly they end this campaign, and Schultz does that classic thing where he's like, "Oh, we were planning to end it after a week anyway. It was only supposed to be 1 week anyway." Like, so he's like, he claims that it was only supposed to last for a week, but obviously, like, there was a lot of roasting online, and
I think he said the same thing about his political campaign.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
It also lasted about a week.
Exactly. And look, I don't know. I think we've done a pretty good job here of kind of being nuanced about it. I'm not trying to be in the kind of like, Starbucks defender role here, but I do, revisiting this story, see the kind of kernels of very important things. And
I appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Schultz himself has talked about like learning a lot of lessons from this, and they, I think, have been fairly good on like implicit bias training for the baristas. But then, of course, it continues to be this question of like, yes, but how about just let them unionize? How about just pay them a little bit more? How about just like actually address some of these structural inequalities?
Yeah.
Well, and just to add on to that, because I think this is actually what Starbucks needs to be roasted for. Like the idea behind diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility was that it's supposed to create more economic opportunity for people who have been excluded from it. And what has happened is that corporations use DEI as a substitute for those economic opportunities and for economic equality. And that the fact that Starbucks was union busting at the same time they were doing this, I think shows how shallow that commitment actually was.
Yeah.
And can I just say, and this might sound superficial, but like, can I just get my white chocolate mocha filled all the way to the brim? Like, I don't want 3/4 of a cup.
That's your reparations,
I paid $7 for. Yeah, I want my full cup. I want every single drop I paid for. That's my gripe.
Fair enough. A good note to end it on. Well, I'm really glad we got to this one. It has come up a couple times. A few listeners have suggested we do this, so shout out to everyone who's been urging us to do this one. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.